Hello, Professor Steinberg. Thank you
Hello.
for coming onto my channel. For all of the people who don't know, this is Mark Steinberg, Professor, what is that? Emeritus?
Emeritus.
Emeritus,
It
okay.
means I'm retired.
Oh, there you go.
Fancy word for retirement.
Right.
Emeritus.
Professor Emeritus at the University of Illinois and the author, most recently, of Russian Utopia, A Century of Revolution and of Revolutionary Possibilities, as well as a number of other works. So again, thank you for coming on my channel. To start, I'm gonna do a bit of a timeline questionnaire here. We're gonna start at the very beginning of the Russians. So the Mongols, I'm gonna kind of skip over the Rus because I don't want to get into the Scandinavians and all that, but the Mongols kind of came in and they sort of set Russia on the course for having a dominant Muscovy. Do you think, what other impacts do you think they had on the development of the Russian people, the Mongol conquests?
Yeah, I didn't know you were going to go so far back, but that's fine with me. In addition to writing a lot of books on the Revolutionary Era, I do a history textbook too.
Oh,
so
awesome.
Called A History of Russia. It's just one.
Okay.
So, you know, you said you don't want to talk about the Rus to bring in the Scandinavians. We'll leave the Scandinavians out, but actually thinking about pre-Mongol Russia, going back, say, well, we'll only go back to the 9th or 10th century, let's be modest, is actually part of the answer to your question. Because first of all, even the question of where Russia is a problem, because there is no nation state in an early stage. There are peoples, there's tribes, there's a political order created by, which became known as Rus or Russia, as the Scandinavians had a lot to do with. But what's really interesting is by the time we get to it's sometimes called the Kievan era, because that's the main capital was in Kiev, now in another country, in Ukraine. What we have in the late Kievan era is a fairly developed society, somewhat decentralized, though there's a grand prince. But all the principalities have a lot of autonomy, and they have different political systems in some ways. Some, for example, elect their prince. Some have the power to call their prince to account in a public square, and every certain class and above citizen had a right to question them and even run them out of town, which occasionally happened. So one might say what you have is a urbanized, economically vibrant, there's huge trade, especially with Greece, agriculturally rich, full of crafts, and some degree of civic citizen participation, as you would have in, medieval Europe as well.
Right, of course.
So it's a fairly rich and dynamic society. Then come the Mongols. So the first thing the Mongols do is they destroy Russia. They destroy what was a dynamic, vibrant society. And they have a very simple goal. They don't want to kill lots of people. They do, because it makes a point. It sort of impresses people that they're serious. You need to obey. What they wanted was to take stuff. They wanted, unlike the previous conquerors, one might say, you said we wouldn't mention the Scandinavians, but one has to. Their goal was not to conquer. Their goal was to set up a rich trade route that came down from Scandinavia and to rule, and they intermarried. They became part of the society. They let people rise in class and join them. The Mongols had a very different approach. They wanted to dominate. It's more like an empire. It was an empire. It's called that after all. It's not the modern empires that we think of, but it is an imperial form. And it is basically dominate, control, intimidate when needed, and extract raw materials and other goods, including people, as needed. And so what happened is you brutalized Russian society. They burnt towns to make a point, but and those towns had to recover, but basically they exploited Russia. Now, that's not the only part of the story. Part of the story is Russians said, well, those guys have a lot better military skill than we did. The old Russians weren't that interested in military issues. They had to learn if they were ever to get rid of the Mongols. They learned a lot of skills. The Mongols had a centralized way of extracting material, so they learned certain forms of statecraft, much more authoritarian, much more centralized, much more military oriented. So Russians learned some, you might say, good things, and were able to liberate themselves. The only way they could liberate themselves, so one is what the Mongols did. The other is the process of liberating required all those little independent principalities to unite in a much more authoritarian, centralized system, and a military one in order to overthrow the Mongols. Out of that comes the Muscovite state, which is the authoritarian state we associate with Russia. But I don't want to go so far as to say I blame the Mongols. There's all sorts of other reasons, but nothing was the same after Mongol influence on Russia. And
for sure,
for me, it was quite negative.
Yeah, right. I would tend to agree with that because, of course, I mean, like you said, the Kievan Rus was doing fine all on its own, and it could have gone in a totally different directions. But right, the Mongols show up, and that seems to be a trend with countries that the Mongols that grow out of the former Mongol empires. They become a lot more authoritarian and centralized and repressive. Yeah, that's one of the consequences of having been under occupation. Because, right, like you said, they have to deal with these occupiers. Yeah. And figure out, okay, if we want to overthrow these guys, how do we go about this? And right, that again, then ends up being a lot more centralized authoritarian regime.
And if I could say, one might argue that this isn't just a particular historical story about the Mongols, it's a story about imperial domination. That every imperial, including in the modern era, every form has damaging consequences on the people who they rule, including in the way what people have to do to liberate themselves.
Yeah.
It often leads to authoritarianism.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. For sure.
Avoid imperial domination. That's what I would say.
Yes, at all costs.
Hasn't served anybody well.
No. Well, and one could argue that's kind of the history of state building, right? Is I'm trying to avoid being dominated, especially by a foreign force. And so often people will allow local rulers to be dictatorial if it means avoiding foreign domination, and imperial rule.
Quite.
So yeah, exactly. That's a big deal. So the first, of course, notable popular ruler of Russia was Ivan the Terrible, which is not a great title of all the ones that are out there.
I'll correct his title for you in a minute.
There you go. But do you think, of course, he has this title as the Terrible, but a lot of people don't know a lot of the state building that he did. I mean, he really set Russia up on a good path. And a lot of people think that, it might have been mercury poisoning that really led him down the path that he ended up going on. But do you think overall that Ivan was a net positive or negative for the Russian state as it was developing?
It's hard to say something so simple. Let me work my way into an answer. So the first thing is actually terrible is a mistranslation.
Okay.
So the first thing about understanding Ivan the Terrible and his reception and how people understood him and his impact on Russia is to know that his actual name is Ivan Grozny. That's the title. Of course, his real name is Ivan Vasilievich, Ivan, son of Vasily,
right.
Ivan IV in terms of his rulership. But he was given the name, just like you get Peter the Great and others, he was given the name Grozny. What Grozny means in Russian, you could translate it into French as terrible, but you can't translate it into terrible in English, at least not the way we hear English anymore, which means bad.
Right.
Grozny means fierce, mighty, awesome, impressive. These are dark, these are violent sometimes, but it's a positive term.
Yeah, right, but it's not terrible. It
doesn't mean he's terrible. Right. It doesn't even focus on killing or violence, though there was plenty of that. It really focuses on the might. And in this sense, he's a modern monarch who, like a lot of others in the 16th century, who used force to build, as you say, to build a modern state. Right. It's very much part of building the state. What does he do? And this, I'll get to whether I think this was good or bad. Well, it depends on your politics, one might say, even 16th century politics.
Right.
What does he do is he's got a problem that one of the effects of Mongol rule had been to create a weakness by having all sorts of authorities at work. Boyars, which were aristocrats, landed proprietors, all sorts, and of course, he himself helped liberate, was one of the key battles, liberating them from Mongol rule. But what he also did is he needed to create a state that would be, once he freed Russia from the Mongols, a state that would be listened to by all parts of the population. In other words, a modern centralized state. And what he faced were very selfish local authorities, aristocrats, merchants, and others who couldn't care less about the common good at all.
Well, and of course, this is an area that's coming out of Mongol rule where you kind of needed to be, selfish. These were small states that were trying to protect themselves, right? And were beholden to the Mongols. So of course, that was kind of the setup that he was given,
Exactly. And so what do you do with all those people? Well, you tell them you have a choice. Either you have loyalty to the state, and he was very much like, other monarchs in Europe who made the claim, right, as the French did, the state is me. L'état est moi. I am the state. It's not about this like arrogant sense of self. It's about, if we're going to have a state, the only one I know of in the modern era is the state of strong, centralized, absolutist monarchy. And therefore, people didn't want absolutist monarchy, at least not the elites. And so used enormous violence to crush the aristocratic class. One might say Russia was in a sort of feudal-like society, and it comes out of it as an early modern centralized state. Ivan the Terrible did that. Now, is that a good thing? Well, if you think history requires going through absolutism to get to modernity, then yes, he was an absolutist in a European model and comparable to other rulers, except for a sort of madness toward the end of his life, which can be explained in all sorts of ways. But fundamentally, he was a radical reformer creating a modern centralized state, an absolutist state. I'm not fond of absolutism, but it's not a question of what I like, and it's a question of what was appropriate at that point in Russian history. And one could argue without an absolutist state, you don't have a strong military, you can't defend your borders. Eventually, you're going to be somebody else's colony. Probably, eventually, it would have been Poland, Lithuania that ruled Russia. But by the time they were really, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was really strong, and there were already attempts in Ivan the Terrible's time for Poland and Lithuania to rule Russia. Russia, because of this absolutist strength, could push back on Polish-Lithuanian rule. If they couldn't, Poland would be the most dominant power in Europe, in a certain sense. And Russia would have been a Catholic country. There's all sorts of interesting possibilities, but it didn't happen.
For sure.
Whether that's good or bad, it's how it went.
Yeah. Well, and so it's interesting. I have a friend who also has a YouTube channel. He and I often discuss how America was able to get away with creating strong democratic institutions like Britain on a continental scale due to weak neighbors, right? Now, Poland wasn't exactly democratic in the way that we have it now, but as far as the 16th, 17th century goes, they were relatively democratic. Do you think that gave them disadvantages when facing a more centralized militaristic state like, autocratic Russia?
Poland, even Poland, Lithuania, and even the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which really did have about as much democracy as anybody was going to get in Europe in that period. And it's often forgotten. I mean, their history tends to be overlooked because of the great empires, absolutist empires around it. They weren't absolutist. They were not quite like the British monarchy today, but leaning in that direction.
Right, of course.
Did that make them weak? I don't think so. They had a very strong army. And they knew military skills were necessary, but they're small. I mean, even at the full extent of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, you couldn't beat an army the size of Russia. And in fact, more skillful armies have lost to the Russians again and again, because the Russians are simply bigger and more numerous. The other thing is Russians have always been, for a long time, one could think about when, since Ivan the Terrible, for sure, felt that defending their land against Catholics, in particular, against other people who were not Orthodox.
Right.
I mean, when the Mongols came, they weren't Muslims, they were just Mongols.
Right.
They became
Yeah.
Muslim as time went on, but they were still not Orthodox.
Right.
Defending their land against the non-Orthodox neighbors, which they're surrounded by,
Mhm.
has always been an inspiration. And that it quickly turns into a question of nation by Soviet times, obviously.
Yeah.
And so it is partly that they're big, it's the image of the bear, right?
Yeah.
But this is a bear with national pride,
Mhm. Right.
and that really makes a difference. And it's never clear that conquering countries like Poland, Lithuania, even with a very skillful army, Sweden tries to do the same thing at a later point during Peter the Great. It's not clear that they can really win against a large country with a motivated army, which in some ways they had.
Yeah, well, and of course, Poland was a big, it wasn't the primary, well, one could argue it was, but of course, Russia went through the time of troubles, and Poland was part of those troubles. How close do you think the Russian state was to really breaking or falling apart during that time? Do you think there was a real possibility that it might have?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. And it's interesting. So the Russian term for the time of troubles is smuta, S-M-U-T-A, and or smutное время, the troubled times. But they just say smuta, which is an old word for really bad problems. Real catastrophe isn't strong enough a word for what smuta suggests. In different times in Russian history after that, in particular, at the end of communism in the 1990s, people remembered that term and talked about living again in a time of troubles, because it is the time when everything was at stake. And that also, we can talk about what Ivan the Terrible did, and he actually contributed to the breakdown ultimately because of the chaos of his later years, where he really lost rationality in some ways. He became much more destructive.
Right.
The time of troubles was a time of disorder, of violence, of civil war, of foreign invasion. I mean, the civil war after the communists come to power, is modest compared to
right.
Nothing. And that was a time of famine and death and civil war and foreign invasion. It was worse during the time of troubles. And how they survived it has to do with a lot of circumstances, but one of them is the myth that Russians tell themselves still today. They still remember. I mean, if everybody has seen pictures of Red Square and the Kremlin, if you're standing at one end, historical museum to your back, on the right, you see the Kremlin. Ahead of you, you see St. Basil's Cathedral. Everybody knows this image. And right there next to St. Basil is the statue of Minin and Pozharsky. Still to this day, Minin and Pozharsky, it's right in front of the St. Basil's. And it was set up much later. Minin and Pozharsky was the peasant and the nobleman who united Russia to fight and to bring the country, to fight against the Poles and bring the country back together. This idea that the elites and the people will unite to save Russia from chaos and preserve the nation is right there on a monument in Red Square, and it still is one of the dominant myths that Russians keep telling themselves. It's not 100% true, but there was enough truth that for centuries up to the present, people could say, this is what will happen no matter what. And there's some really interesting moments in the 19th century when they're talking about real democratic reform, constitution, parliament, voting, all of that. But a constitutional monarchy, in which one of the arguments made against it is you can't do that, because remember the time of troubles, we made a deal, and the deal was that the people would unite for the sake of the nation if they had a monarch who served them. And the job, and basically the people at the end of the time of troubles created an autocrat, and that's what they called the ruler, especially then, created an autocrat and said, the only thing that's going to save us is a strong state.
Yeah.
And this became part of the argument. The people united will never be defeated, to use that phrase that you hear all around the world.
Right.
But in the Russian thing, it's followed by the line, right? The people united will never be defeated as long as we have an absolutist government that will protect us from our enemies and from ourselves. And
Yeah.
part of the myth was we have a tendency to fight each other. We need somebody who will knock heads together, and you can hear all the rulers who end up doing that in
Right.
order to keep the country united. So this is the way the story Russians tell about themselves. It has enough truth to be justified. Obviously, as a historian, I would say it's a lot more complicated than that.
Right, of course. And it always is more complicated, but right. I mean, you always see these situations where a nation is facing serious points of crisis. And in those moments of crisis, people are much more likely to turn to authoritarianism.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter when in history you are. I mean, even today, if your country faces a serious crisis, there's a real good chance people will turn to authoritarian leaders, however they present themselves.
We could see it in recent history for sure.
Right, exactly. Yep. Constant threat. So of course, invasions from Poland were a big problem during this time. And you can see sort of Russia starting to push back on that over the course of the latter half of the 17th century, certainly into the 18th century. And of course, as we all know, Russia comes to dominate basically all of Poland and all of its former area. Do you think that Russian animosity towards Poland was fueled by the time of troubles, or do you feel like there's not that much animosity?
It's the other way around. Polish animosity toward Russia is enormous.
Well, and of course that's because the Russians came in and stole the whole country.
So there aren't too many countries in the modern world.
Mm-hmm.
Some would argue Palestine is one of the strong examples of that, where the country is basically disappears because of the presence of other countries. In this case, somewhat partly Prussia, partly Russia. Again and again, Poland is made to disappear. And if we talk about a sense of national identity and pride, the Poles are among the strongest throughout Europe. Sure. Very strong sense of Polish identity. Even when allied with Lithuanians, they still knew they were Poles.
Yeah.
and it mattered. And so the way they're not so fond of the Prussians either. But the Russians have always seen, partly as a fellow Slavic people, partly because so many times they've been dominated, including in the 18th century partitions, so that they cease to exist. The resentment is very strong. And there's even great jokes about that, by the way, if I could throw a joke in.
For sure.
At the end of communism, when it was ending in 1989 or so, there was a question to the Poles. So if you're invaded on one side from the East Germans and the other side from the Soviets, the Russians, of course they put it, who will you fight first? And the Polish answer was the Germans first, business before pleasure. Whereas the Russians, the Poles are like, whatever, why do they don't like us so much? There's almost a sense of disdain as opposed to, any real animosity.
Wow.
The main reason Poland had to be, one might argue from the Russian point of view, had to be occupied was simply to protect them from the Germans. In that sense, the Russians said, you're right, business. The Germans really are scary. The Poles are just in the way. They're just in the way. And it's nice to have some extra land, so let's just occupy them. They're not a serious people. And disdain for Poland is very strong in Russia, and hatred of Russia in Poland is very strong. So it's a complicated story.
Yeah, well, you get this sort of business before pleasure view, so to speak, from all of Europe. You look to the neighbor to your west, right? And it's like, well, I have to deal with that neighbor, but really the one I hate is the one to the east of me. And I think of that from, France's perspective for Britain and Germany, and Germany's perspective for France and Russia. There's certainly this chain of viewing the person, right, in Europe, especially the person to your east, the country to your east, as inferior to your own civilization,
and dangerous often.
And dangerous, and of course Russia being sort of the eastern wall, so to speak, of Europe. looked, I think, after the Mongol conquest, kind of looked at steppe civilizations and said, we're never doing that again. And do you think that their attempt to never face the sort of situation they were in with the Mongols sort of spurred their drive to the east?
It's the drive to the east is interesting because they don't really take it in a sustained way until the 19th century. You know, they just sort of ignore the east. It seems irrelevant, backward, underdeveloped, not worth worrying about. And when they do go to war with Eastern powers, especially Japan, they're a little surprised that the Japanese are as modern as they are. They really don't think they are. And they think, oh, that'll be easy. Those people, they don't know how to fight. They're Japanese. They actually called them worse things than that. And so, but in the 19th century, there was the idea that everybody needs to be an empire. And as you know, for a while, Alaska was part of that empire. Because everybody said you needed an overseas empire. The colonies overseas never worked out for Russia, and they got rid of it pretty quickly. But it was what every great power was doing. Germany went to Africa. That was also a waste of their efforts. Belgium went to Africa. You know, it's only the British really knew how to do empire well, but everybody wanted to do it in the same way. And the British took it much more seriously and in a lot of ways too, and had a powerful empire. Yeah, they had India. Nobody else had anything like it. So the Russians expanded partly because they thought, a couple of reasons. I mean, one, they thought empires need to be bigger. So spread to the map, because who's out there? Nobody. The other was empires need to be modern. I mean, we're talking about modernity here. There's a lot of raw resources out there. There's gold in particular. There's places to plant to develop cotton fields. There's more coal. There's all sorts of things needed to fuel a modern society, as well as workers. And that there was always the fear, well, eventually, if we don't do it, China will start crossing the border. That's who they were afraid of. So this comes quite late, and then they have to figure out how to dominate these people. But then they develop a sort of ideology by the middle of the 19th century, early middle of 19th century, this idea that, and it's super strong by Nicholas II's time, that we're a different sort of empire. The British think everybody's inferior. The Germans think everybody's inferior. The French, everybody dominates out of a sense of white superiority, not us. We understand that we are Asians too, that we are Eurasians, that we live on the boundaries, that yes, we have the best of Europe because we've absorbed Europe, but ultimately we're the brother nations with China, especially China. And you see a lot of this. And so there are all these advisors, especially under Nicholas II, it becomes fully developed. When he's about to become czar, instead of taking his grand tour, which every heir to the throne is supposed to do, of Western Europe, he goes to Asia. He does a grand tour of India, of China, of Japan. He's actually stabbed when he's in Japan in the head by a guy who wants to destroy the Russian Empire. And he says, oh, but he's an exception. The Japanese are good people. And there's this real sense of Russia needs to look east, because its easternness is going to make Russia a different and superior empire to that of any other European empire. So stop just imitating Europe, recognize your Asian aspects. And that becomes very interesting. So in that sense, the expansion partly is for practical geopolitical and economic reasons, but very quickly becomes part of the self-definition of what Russia is. And that's still true.
Fascinating. I didn't even know that was the case. I mean, and they are. I mean, 3/4 of the landmass is in Asia, of course. So yes, very much an Asian nation as well. But wow, to know that their leaders were aware of that and recognized that is certainly something you don't hear very often. That's fascinating. Now, of course, their expansion to the West ends up being significantly more difficult than any sort of Eastern movement that they and that is, of course, at the expense of Poland. Now, cutting up Poland puts them in direct contact with Austria and Prussia, who are big powers of the day, especially in the 19th century. Do you, and this is pretty opinionated, but do you think that cutting up a buffer state and putting your border on strong nations like that, do you think that would actually be a net positive for the Russian Empire? Do you think there was just a bit of hubris on their part to take all these lands for themselves, cut out a buffer state, and then share a border with two of the strongest countries in Europe at that time?
You know, it's interesting to look at it from a couple of generations, a generation later.
Right after the fact.
Yeah. You know, once this is all well established by the end of the 18th century,
Mm-hmm.
and it's clear where the borders now are,
Right.
it's clear that Poland is not coming back, at least it seems. I mean, it was
Right.
hard to imagine how Poland would return,
Right.
because there was a real agreement with Austria and Germany
Yeah,
that this was
yeah.
how it was going to be. There was no problem there. The Russian Empire had a stronger foothold in both Europe. It also had buffer zones.
Mm-hmm.
It had resources it could draw on. By the early 19th century, one of the concerns that the Russian state had was that they still look at us as savages.
Mm.
They don't show enough respect, because it wasn't just geopolitical. It was, we want to prove that we're a European empire.
Right.
So even while moving to the east, though the ideology that we're also an Asian empire doesn't develop until the 1860s and beyond,
Mm-hmm.
by the early 19th century, those moves into the West gave them a stronger sense. We are Europe.
Mm-hmm.
We are physically in Europe, and we are fundamentally, I mean, since Peter the Great, we are and Catherine the Great, the great Europeanizers, Westernizers, we often call it. And then in the early 19th century, there's a whole Westernizer intellectual tradition.
Right, of course.
But yet so many people felt, especially rulers like Alexander I, said, but they still look at us as, well, as bears, he actually said at one point. They don't think we're civilized Europeans. Look at us. Peter the Great had them all wear wigs and shave. And they still thought they were savages. We're not Muscovites anymore. Look at us.
Mm-hmm.
A century after Peter the Great, it was still a concern they weren't seen as European enough.
Yeah.
Which is where one of the reasons that Alexander I thinks joining the war against Napoleon is a great idea. Because finally, everything they've gained, all that presence, that buffer zone, that engagement with Central Europe as both occupier, but also engaged in all sorts of ways in Central European life.
Yeah.
Maybe if we joined those Central European powers and marched all the way to Paris, to Western Europe, and showed them who we are, then maybe we'll get the respect we deserve. And so I think it was still a battle for them to benefit in their desires, to benefit from that move west. And in some ways, I would say the march to Paris was the biggest move west and the most important one. Everything looked differently after the fact that the Russian armies marched all the way into Paris.
Yeah, well, right. And I mean, I think that during the 19th century was almost certainly the time where they had the most respect from Europe. But I feel like even with that, I would you say that there's still this sort of awareness in Russian culture that they're on the fringes of Europe and that Europe's never really accepted them as part of their sort of state system?
Always. Listen to how often Putin talks about being insulted.
Yeah,
Russia is being insulted. Russia is being disrespected. He says it all the time. And he's constantly he's haranguing people, including Russians, but also the West, to remember all the great things Russia has done. In fact, one of the things about Putinism has been the most explicit in really a long time, maybe ever, ideological stance about history, which says, of course, bad things happen. Everybody does bad things. Every country has dark moments, but let's focus on all the good things that have happened, even in the darkest times. Let's remember like your question, let's remember the good things Ivan the Terrible did.
Right.
Let's remember the good things Stalin did. Let's not always dwell. Why do we beat ourselves up? And besides, the West is watching when we do it. Let's remember the good things we've done. Like Stalin, well, we beat Hitler. Maybe the West couldn't have done it without us. You know, this, I think, and this grows out of, a simple description would be an inferiority complex, but there's certainly a sense of being insulted, being looked down upon, seen as primitive. And of course, I mean, I grew up in the Cold War,
Yeah.
and we were supposed to be afraid of Russians, but actually we mocked them as much as anything else. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
look at Russians in movies from that era.
Right.
They're
Right.
they're not scary, except for, well, in the Rocky series, you get
Right.
some.
Right.
Basically, they're bumbling idiots half the time.
Yeah.
So, and this hurts actually.
Yeah. Right. I'm sure it is. And of course that's always an issue when, you're trying to be part of this in group, right? Especially Europe in
Yeah.
the 19th century is the elite. I mean, they're moving to
Yeah.
dominate the world. And
Yeah.
Russia's like, well, we're dominating the world just as much as, the rest of you. We're second
Yeah.
only to Britain over here as far as territory goes.
Yeah.
And right, they still can't get that respect. And I can't imagine how frustrating it is for their whole culture to be like, we really have done everything we possibly could to be part of this, and you guys still, stick your noses up at us,
And one might argue, when communism ended, if the world could have done more to encourage Russia to be exactly what Putin said, and Yeltsin especially before that said, is we want to be a completely European society with democracy, with civil rights, with everything.
Right.
Give us a help, because we could use a little help.
Yeah.
And the help that they got was not the most productive.
No,
and then since we're now re-isolating Russia, and that's always a bad idea. The more we isolate them, the more dangerous they become.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
Especially toward their own people.
Yeah. No, I'm sure. I don't want to get too much into American policy, but yeah, I definitely don't think that isolating, especially such a large country, is ever a good idea.
Yeah. And by the way, to just again, history's not linear, right? The present and the past connect in all sorts of ways. It helps us understand the past. The contemporary relationship with China by the US insults the Russians in all sorts of ways, because for them, we're more developed, we're more democratic, we're not ruled by a communist party, and why are you so friendly to them and so hostile to us? And I think there's a lot of, it goes deeper in Russian history to go back, of the way whether you engage or whether you isolate makes a difference in how Russia behaves. Yeah. And we're back doing the isolation, making it worse by being friendly to China, for example.
Yeah. Yeah.
For obvious reasons, of course.
Right. Yeah. And personally, I don't think that's
a side trip. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's fine. So now you mentioned Catherine and Peter the Great's attempts to modernize and westernize Russia. Yeah. In your opinion, who do you think was the greater ruler of the two?
So Russians have a saying that basically Peter, in creating modern Russia, gave us a body, whereas Catherine gave us a soul. Peter, they sometimes say, was our father of modern Russia. Catherine's our mother. Now, there's hardly a society that don't like mothers better than fathers. Right. I say, as a father, because of the, it's not about gender's essential nature, but the social roles that gender
produces. Of course.
And in the context of Russia, Peter the Great laid very important groundwork, but he had to do so in a fairly formal way, hence the body, right? Cut people's beards off, make them dressed in a Western style, change the alphabet, change the calendar. A lot of physical, build new buildings, make people look differently. Yeah. But he didn't really change people's insides, but he started with the outside. He actually thought, it's like we have a saying, dress makes the man. He thought if you took a Russian and put a nice an aristocrat, put a powdered wig, shaved off his beard, put him in Western clothes, he would begin to think differently. He didn't worry about women too much.
Yeah, of course.
Catherine built on that. So it's not like which was greater. You couldn't have one without the other. And frankly, in between, there was a very important ruler, Elizabeth, who did a lot as well. Very important. I mean, 18th century has more women rulers than men. Yeah. But Catherine was the greatest of them. But she built on all of her successors. And for Catherine, it was, we need to go deeper. We need to go beyond. We've taken care of the superficials. There's no question Russia is a European nation. She says so again and again and again,
Right.
Explicitly. But now we need to think about our emotions. We need to think about our culture. We need to think not just, are we literate and do we learn European languages, but do we think about European ideas? And she was really determined, and this was succeeded by especially her grandson, Alexander I, to bring Western values without compromising authoritarianism, absolutism. But that wasn't unusual. It's the late 18th century. There were lots of enlightened absolutists, and she's a classic.
Right.
She did enormous amount. It's hard not to, well, again, depends on what your political tastes. Peter and Catherine were great, but of course, they're called Peter the Great and Catherine the Great because of their military successes.
Right.
Great only means you win wars, and they both won very important wars against foreign enemies. But they were really great rulers. They were leaders in very profound and important ways, both with limitations. One could list all the things that Peter did wrong, but he did a lot that there are reasons for that. And Catherine's limitations, especially after the French Revolution, which really scared Catherine. And she began to think, oh my God, is this what happens when you bring Enlightenment ideas? Voltaire and Rousseau and Diderot. Is this what happens? They get the guillotine on kings. This doesn't sound good. So she got very nervous and began to pull back. But it couldn't be undone. She had transformed Russia as Peter had. Russia is never the same after those two rulers. The 18th century is often forgotten. It's the most transformative century in many ways. And then you play out all the issues are played out in the 19th and 20th century, even today.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Now, you said that Russia had in the 18th century more female rulers than anywhere else,
year by year, if you count the years. They were mostly women.
Now, of course, Maria Theresa takes the throne of Austria and kicks off the War of Austrian Succession, which, is really just a pretense for Prussia to grab Silesia and all that other stuff. But, Austria is integral to the European state system at this point. And a woman trying to take the throne, even if it is just a pretense, is an issue in that sort of system. Now, Russia, of course, sits on the margins. Nobody really cares. How often do you think that Russia being sort of on the margins of this state system has actually benefited them, even though they don't necessarily like it? It's not their favorite. They feel kind of shunted to the side. Do you feel like that's come in as a benefit to them, over and over?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. There's obviously being on the margins has been a disadvantage in that their borders are not clear. It's not like they have long-standing borders. Their borders were moving a lot. Throughout all their history. Which is why, I could say at the beginning, where is Russia? Even who are the Russians is even a question. And so being on the margins, they're in this more geographically and ethnically open and fluid space, which could argue is one of the reasons they thought they needed authoritarianism, because there's too much flux. It's not a stable, concentrated area. So being on the margins is very dangerous, because the margins are always where people are moving. Being on the margins of Europe and Asia. We talked about the Mongols. The Mongols, didn't go to France. It's had other problems. Germany had other problems. On the other hand, being on the margin also meant they could reach into Europe without having to feel that they were completely entwined in all the European sort of state relations, although increasingly they wanted to be. Increasingly they began making alliances and deals, and most of the big wars from the 18th century on are European wars fundamentally. Even with Turkey, it's still fundamentally a European war, and not to mention the Crimean War. This was a Central European war on Russian territory, with the Russians involved. So, in the Napoleonic War before that, really. So I think it pulled and pushed both ways. I think it certainly whether it's helped or not, the certain thing is that you're right to ask the question, because being on the margins mattered. It affected them constantly throughout their history and still today.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and they've shown that, a lot of countries, right, when there is a sort of state system that countries are working with, it is generally one on the margins of that state system that end up becoming dominant. Perfect example is the Macedonians. The Greeks have their state system, and the Peloponnesian War ends up ruining Athens and Sparta, which opens the door for the Macedonians to come in, take over Greece, and then march against Persia. And even though it took Russia a while, and they didn't walk away with all of Europe, but the communists certainly took half the continent with them.
Oh, yeah.
It can be a benefit to sort of be overlooked at times. It's, they've shown that those countries can often come in and gain a certain level of dominance over at least some area of the state system.
Yeah, I mean, I think occupying Russia's ability to occupy some of its neighbors is because it's far away from the great powers of Europe. It's like,
right,
until they get to a certain point, and then it's like, wait, this is
right.
us.
Oh, right. And I mean, oftentimes France or England is asking themselves, oh, do I really want to go to war over some plot of land in underdeveloped Eastern Europe?
Like Poland.
Yeah, right.
Do you really want to go to war over Poland? Same thing happened when the Nazis took part.
Right, exactly. It's like
I don't know. It's sort of far away.
Yeah, yeah. Now, of course, Catherine the Great came from a German state. The people who sort of set up the Kievan Rus are Scandinavians. Stalin famously is a Georgian. You have a lot of foreigners ending up in charge of the Russian state. I mean, I don't know exactly the percentage, but some amount of the Russian nobility was German. Are the Russians aware of this? Is this something that bothers them? Is this something they even recognize?
So yes, because there is a periodic critique, especially strong by the early 20th century, of what's called Great Russian Chauvinism, which is to say those of us who are, Nicholas II called it true Russians, people who are ethnically pure, Orthodox, rooted, going way back into the Slavic past, are the real Russians. And there was a problem of chauvinism. But in reality, while that existed, it's sort of like, maybe this isn't a good comparison, it's sort of like white chauvinism, white supremacy in the United States. It's out there. It's not ever been the dominant, I think it's never been the dominant characteristic of American culture, but it's always been there. Yeah. Great Russian chauvinism, true Russian nationalism is there, and there's some really nasty types still running around. Yeah. Often they volunteer to go to war in Ukraine right now, because they consider Ukrainians to be little Russians, not great Russians. And this, so there is a problem. But the reality is of Russian history from the 9th century on, the awareness that there are multiple peoples living in this space. It's a multi-ethnic, multinational polity, a multi-ethnic, multinational empire. It's one of those things I mentioned how Nicholas II began talking about the multiplicity of peoples, Asians and Europeans, and all the religions became part of a sort of myth about Russia. Yes, it's been a theme that it's been a worry, but the reality is Russia has been, one might say, cosmopolitan, to use that more modern term, for a very long time. They, in the first myth about Russian history, the very first one, was that they invited the Vikings to come down and rule them. Actually, the Vikings conquered them, but then the Vikings told the story, we were invited and they love us. And this keeps coming up as a theme. So the idea that your monarchs are part German, and Scandinavian also, the Danish mother, the Nicholas II's mother is Scandinavian. There's that, because Alexander III's wife was his mother. The fact that she was German and not even Orthodox, she had to convert to Orthodoxy and learn to speak Russian and change her name. That wasn't her name, which was Sophie. And all the important leaders. I mean, a real interesting example is to look into the Soviet period, if we'll ever get there, and think about Trotsky, and think about Stalin. Yes, there were people for whom the fact that Trotsky was Jewish was a problem. There are people who, for the fact that Stalin was a Georgian, was a problem, but mostly that's not what they hated Stalin or Trotsky for, or loved Trotsky or Stalin for. It was seen as yeah, of course the place is full of aliens, one might say, and they're therefore not aliens. So, this is why I say, who are the Russians, one might say, from the beginning all the way to the present. Yeah. Yes, there are people who are nationalists about it, but frankly, they're a minority. They're a problem. They're dangerous. Yeah. But the reality is Russia is a multi-ethnic, multicultural, to use a more modern term, place, and always has been. Yeah. And that's Russian history, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a very good assessment. Now, so we've, of course, briefly mentioned, that Alexander thought it was a good idea. Alexander I was like, oh, let's march our armies all the way to Paris, and then they'll really see who we are. So how much, I don't know how much study you've done on Alexander I, but how much do you think that he really sort of looked up to Napoleon? And do you think they could have reached an agreement at any point? Or do you think that Napoleon was just far too off for that to be realistic?
He had great admiration for him. And they did reach an agreement, at least for a while.
Right, for some time.
Yeah. Alexander is a very complicated ruler, maybe the most complicated. That I can think of in Russian history. He was sometimes referred to by people at the time as the Hamlet on the throne, because he was like, I don't know what to do, to be or not to be, to kill my uncle or not to kill my uncle, all these Hamletian qualities. He was constantly torturing himself. He was probably the best educated monarch, even better educated maybe than Catherine. And that's because Catherine insisted that he be well educated. He had great teachers. He was a good student, but he loved the army. He loved marching. He loved field maneuvers. He loved being a soldier. He loved seeing himself on horseback. Napoleon was also a complicated ruler, a ruler who was both conquering Europe, but also trying to actually bring the spirit of the French Revolution, slightly modified, but nonetheless, liberty, equality, fraternity. So Napoleon's full of complexity in ways that Alexander I sort of shared, but there were also important differences. So Alexander's maybe one of the most interesting monarchs, precisely because he's so tormented about what. At one point, even nature bothers him. There's a terrible flood in the capital, and it's horrible. And of course, he can't stop floods. Right. He gets on a hillside and he stands with his court, and he begins to cry out of a sense of his own inability to make people's lives better. I mean, he's a sensitive, intellectually sophisticated, but military oriented ruler who really wanted Russia to be a better place. He lacked the power to do so, and he couldn't help loving the military, because every Russian does. They have great uniforms. You can't resist it. So yeah, he's a very interesting ruler, complicated one. And remember, it's at the end of his reign that Russia has its first modern revolution, the Decembrist Rebellion of 1825, by people who really were very much sort of following Alexander. They were influenced. They often worked in his government. They were inspired by him, and then disappointed as he began to move back from some of the reforms he promised. And then comes Nicholas I, who's just actually, they knew already was going to be terrible. Right. Truly terrible. Oh, yeah. Nationalist, narrow-minded, anti-foreign, they just knew this was a guy who was going to be bad. And that's when they make their first revolution. Yeah. Again, it's the question of where Russia's going is a continual battle, but an actual modern revolution. It failed, but it wasn't a
right. But yeah, really the first one. Now I know we said 6:30, but we're in the 19th century, and I was wondering if we could push this to 7 and go just a century further.
All right.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much.
It's up to you. It's up to the patience of people watching this. Yeah. Which you have to decide. Of course, you can always edit it down.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. No. I think this is fantastic content, and I think my viewers will love this. And of course, this is my first try at something like this, but I think this will be very good. I think we're getting a lot done here. So, I mean, the parallel seems obvious to me, and I'm sure other people have made it as well. But, you know, we mentioned Russia is this heavy-handed, centralized, autocratic state. And even when it moves out of the monarchy phase, it still is very much one under the communists. Whereas, and it's always has this sort of push to the east, right? Now, of course, they're looking to the west and to Europe, but their territorial expansion is very much to the east. And like you said, they're very cosmopolitan. America seems almost to be a mirror of that, where they're, you know, we've always been democratic, but we're pushing to the west. And as far as the natives go, we are not very cosmopolitan, but we'll take in the Europeans, you know. And so there does seem to be this parallel here. And would you say that Russia and America, you know, both kind of pop up and they're almost like these mirror images of each other, you know, and they show two very different directions and yet similar directions that societies could go in, and they end up dominating, you know, the latter half of the 20th century.
So the Russian-American story is a really interesting one, even apart from the fact that Alaska was Russian for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a couple of moments that stand out in me in thinking about exactly what do they represent in relationship to one another, and how do they look at one another. So one is in 1825, I was just mentioning the Decembrist uprising, the December Rebellion, the first revolution by very well-educated, very westernized aristocrats, some of whom had been soldiers in Western Europe and actually were in France. And while they were with the occupying army, they went to lectures because, of course, they spoke perfect French. They listened to the university and they read the newspapers. Others had simply studied in Western European universities. And they all come back and they try to overthrow the Tsar and create a democratic society. Some say monarchy, some say no, some say a republic, whatever. Some are sort of Jacobins. But when you look at their ideas, and there's lots of data, a lot of interviews and writings that you could look at. One of the things is they admire the United States very strongly. Now we're talking about early 19th century America. Yeah, they admire the democracy. They admire civic participation in communities. The people organize and work locally. They admire the democratic Republican system, though they think they can combine it with monarchy. And as we know, some of the early US thinkers thought we had to be careful that we have a strong executive, sort of monarchy-like. And they understood that. They appreciated it's a strong executive, not decentralized, but allowed local rights. They were not troubled by slavery, although they shared some of the concerns that had been about slavery, but they, as far as they were concerned, African Americans they came from Africa. They're clearly not developed people. Someday we will get rid of slavery, just as they thought we need to end serfdom in Russia. But, you know, as people become culturally developed, the treatment of Native Americans didn't even bother them at all. Westward expansion, they admired. They thought this is a good example. So there's a lot of similarities. Yeah, for sure. Especially in the perspective of radical Russians. Later in the century, you get a lot of admiration for the United States, precisely because of its forms of civic organization. Lots of attention to, you know, voluntary societies and clubs and organizations, saying that's what Russia needs. The future of Russia is going to be based on that. In fact, they were all reading de Tocqueville's Democracy in America as an example for, yes, this is exactly the course Russia needs. And still in the 20th century, people were saying that. In Soviet times, all of that stays, with the real addition, because now we're talking about post-World War I United States, of technological dynamism. Skyscrapers, bridges, roads, automobiles, you know, every sign of this is like, the future. This is the technological future. And America is the most developed. They were obsessed with skyscrapers. Anybody who could build, you know, a skyscraper, and of course, we're talking about the skyscrapers of the 1920s. They weren't that big. This is before the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building, and much later ones. But nonetheless, the idea you could have this elevator going up 20 stories was just brilliant. And they also were very impressed by bridges. They loved the Brooklyn Bridge in particular.
Wow.
Everybody wrote poems about it. And so there really was this cult. The other thing is they loved Taylor and Ford. So Frederick Taylor, who invented scientific management, they thought that's going to solve the Soviet Union's problems, because it'll create a work environment where we will be so productive, because under capitalism, that won't really happen, they say. Taylor has a dream, but it's not going to happen. But under communism, we can create the most productive society ever seen. Never happened, but that was the idea. And Henry Ford, they admired because of applying some of those principles, but also the idea of the assembly line. America to them was dynamic, fast, modern, and they liked jazz too. And
Wow.
And the best music comes from America. Music that makes your heart beat fast, that makes you alive, not boring little waltzes, but exciting modern music. Then there was a reaction against all of that. But in the 20s, especially, America was idolized for all sorts of those reasons. So I would emphasize how many similarities they had, and two societies on the edge of the world, not respected by Europe as European, but America showed Europe, and the Russians had the same idea. We'll show them in the same way, because now we've got communism and nobody else did it. We are the only, this European dream of communism, we did it, and we're going to show the world what communism could do. More productive, more happy, more joyous, more successful, and we're nice to people who aren't Russians, and we don't conquer the world. People make revolutions and join us. That was the vision. Very utopian.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, there was a lot of utopian visions in the 20th century, most of which were absolute garbage, but or at least the practice was. Now, communism is a very complicated subject today, but there is a strong debate between people on whether the course of communism was corrupted, or its development was seriously impeded or otherwise tarnished by Stalin taking control of the Soviet Union. And I'm wondering what your stance on that sort of matter is do you think that Stalin sort of set the pace of communism on a terrible road that it wasn't going to recover from, and it made the whole situation way worse than it could have been? Or do you think that communism was too idealistic and was, in a sense, sort of doomed to failure from the start, and that it didn't really matter who took control, even if there wasn't this these 5 years plans that starves all these Ukrainians? It's really not going to end up in a good place either way.
Yeah, these are hard questions. For those of us who have been teaching Russian history, or students who have had Russian history courses, one of the two of the biggest debates have always been, you set them up as debates because they lead to good conversations. One is, would Russia have had the Russian Revolution had it not been for World War I? Right? Was Russia heading on to a more modern, democratic, functional society, and the war just created such crisis that all those problems came out? Or was Russia on its way to catastrophe because of all the problems in pre-revolutionary society? You didn't ask that one, so I won't go into it, but it's a serious, there's one could write books about that.
Right, I'm sure.
People have. The other one is, what produced Stalinism? There's no question that Stalinism was, Trotsky, who knew a lot about what Bolshevik rule was supposed to be, referred to it as a betrayal. He considered it a complete betrayal. No matter how you look at it, what Stalin did was not what anybody dreamed of in 1917, 18, 19, 20, 21.
No, yeah.
However, the big debate is, but really didn't Lenin lay the groundwork for Stalinism? In other words, communism was going to not fail, it was going to inevitably lead to dictatorship.
Right.
It was inevitably, and why was it going to lead to dictatorship? Because Russia was simply not a conducive place to build everything they wanted to build, to create a modern society. Karl Marx used to say, Germany, the most advanced capitalist society, is where it will happen. Russia needed development, and Lenin, it was argued, even though he didn't want Stalin. In fact, he tried to dismiss Stalin. He actually ordered Stalin kicked out of the government and all his power taken away, but everybody ignored him, interestingly enough. But the debate is, did Lenin lead to Stalin? So then it gets enormously complicated, because one argument is, yes, the conditions of the Civil War, which is the first story to tell, right after 1917, they had a civil war to fight, required levels of authoritarianism they would rather have not used. But do they just walk away from power and say, oh, well, we didn't know we're going to have to fight.
Right.
No one told us we're going to have to be mean, to hold on to power. So goodbye, we'll just go back into exile into Western Europe. No, Lenin was a very practical person. So was Trotsky. And they said, we did it. We've got it. And there's a lot of reasons why the Bolsheviks came to power in the midst of 1917, rather than keeping the moderate socialist liberal state that they had, which failed in all sorts of ways. It's another story. We could talk for weeks, right?
Right.
But, in once they found themselves fighting a battle, a civil war, once the Bolsheviks were in power, they had a choice. Do we throw our hands up in despair? And some people did. And Lenin said, look, comrades, there's no point. We can't change history. We have power. The people gave it to it. That's how they perceive it. And there's truth to that to some degree. It's our responsibility to do the best we can. And that means taking we don't know. Nobody's ever done this before. And so let's try to build communism. And there are constant changes in policy. So the most interesting moment is once they win the Civil War with a lot of brutality, they back away from authoritarianism, at least at first, because they know that's not the road.
Right, that they want to go down.
The road to revolution, the road to socialism is not built with authoritarian power. But by the mid-1920s, this becomes a debate because the economy is not growing very fast. It's slow. And how do you get the economy to grow faster? And you get people beginning to say, well, we need to use some more force. Remember the Civil War? It worked to defeat our enemies. Maybe it'll work to defeat backwardness. They're still a majority peasant country, and the peasants don't buy communism. They just say, leave us alone. They don't go for it. And the majority is therefore not in support of communism. The only thing to do is turn them into workers. We have to industrialize the country. And this becomes a fierce debate. With, in particular, Bukharin on one side, really arguing, no, Nikolai Bukharin, if we use force against peasants, if we use force to industrialize, we are not going to get socialism, ever. We're going to get something else. And Stalin and Trotsky allied at a certain point, oddly, to say, no, we're going to have a crisis. We're going to be invaded by foreign, and they really believe war might be coming. I mean, World War I, they thought did not settle the problems of the world or Europe. As we know, it was not the war to end all wars. And by the mid-1920s, at least in Russia, they were quite aware that the problems left after World War I were going to lead to another war. And Russia would be attacked. And so the argument was, we can't afford to just stumble through in this state. And so a lot of people found it quite compelling. Stalin said, no, we need to crack heads together again, because otherwise we're going to be conquered. Otherwise we're going to be overthrown because those peasants don't get us. We're going to have a mass industrialization. And so I hate to say that it was sort of logical in the context. Was it inevitable? Hard to say. The outcome of World War I, maybe it would have been different. There's a great moment, very typical Lenin. I think it's either 18 or 19, 18 or 19. He's speaking to the Communist Party Congress. And he says, comrades, I know you're all waiting for the German the Bolshevik Revolution in Germany, right? The Communist Revolution in Germany, because it's supposed to happen. And he said, I know, but he said, I also know that if we don't have a revolution in Western Europe, in particular in Germany, a communist revolution, we are doomed. Those are the words he used. We are doomed. But he said, in the meantime, no despair. We have to do the best we can. But even though he still acknowledged that without support from Western Europe, if Russia was surrounded as a communist country with no other allies, eventually they would be doomed. They would not, they couldn't develop economically enough without help from the West. And eventually they would be invaded because they hated communism. And in that sense, he wasn't wrong. But he might have done what Stalin did. He said, I guess we have to do some terrible things to survive.
Yeah, exactly. And when you're faced with crisis, right, people often think, oh, well, things are pretty terrible. What's one more terrible thing, you know? But right. And I mean, you can, that's the thing I always say is like, oftentimes when people do something that's terrible, they genuinely believe that they're doing the right thing, you know? And right, you can totally see how Stalin, you know, picked up a lot of these problems from Lenin, and he thought, right, it's like, well, we lost the election. What are we going to do? Just walk away, you know? And then he's like, well, we don't have an industrialized nation. Nobody's going to trade with us. How do we deal with these issues? We've got to build autarky. We've got to be industrially self-sufficient.
And by the way, there were a lot of people very excited about that course.
Right.
I mean, the terror wasn't part of it. It wasn't promised. Nobody said, and by the way, we're going to kill millions of you because you're not good enough for us. You know, what they thought was heroism, socialist construction, building huge factories with giant smokestacks, millions of, you know, men and women mobilized for economic construction. This was very exciting.
Yeah.
There was a lot of support for this.
It
was hard, but people were willing.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing is like, especially with the terrors of the early 20th century, I personally like to look at those kinds of states and think how, you know, right, how do people end up supporting those types of regimes? And then, right, when things like that happen, like the 5-year plan, right? If Stalin said, you know, sat in the boardroom and was like, so I'm planning on starving all these Ukrainians to death, right? Nobody's going to be like, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, right? So it's like, how do you pitch this? How do you get people excited about it? How did the Russian people and the Russian state and its leaders convince themselves that this was going to work and this was going to be a good idea? Because, right, it's not like Stalin sat in the boardroom and said, we're going to kill all these people and that's going to make the country better, right? That wasn't the plan.
Right. And to bring, and also it's amazing what people can justify.
Oh gosh, yes. I mean,
to bring it back to the United States, did people feel that killing Indians, Native Americans was a terrible, terrible thing? No, it was necessary.
Right.
Because
we have
otherwise
to.
how would the country develop and expand?
Right.
Did people think that sending boats to Africa and bringing Black bodies to work under the most horrific conditions at a time when people already knew slavery was a more problematic? No, people found ways to justify that.
Right.
And so never underestimate what humans are capable of justifying.
Oh gosh, yeah, no, and everything. It's completely insane to me. But right, I mean, people will justify absolutely terrible things, you know, if they can get the cause right. I don't want to completely skip over World War I, of course, but so Nicholas II, right, he's of course the Russian Tsar at the time. He gets a very bad rap. People look at him as sort of a fumbling idiot or somebody who's completely detached and stuff, or, you know, and some people would be like, oh, he was a good family man, but he wasn't really ready to be the leader. And of course, we can kind of see and tell he wasn't overly thrilled about being the Tsar of Russia. And, you know, like you say in your lecture, he also had this sort of mentality of, well, it's God's will, you know, a lot of things would happen and he'd be like, well, that's God's will. And do you think that his sort of hands-off nature to a lot of things was more due to him not really wanting the job? Or do you think it was more of his religious sense of, well, this is just God's will and I'm not one to interfere with it?
Yeah. You know, for Nicholas was a man of morals in many ways. And by the way, as you know, he's a saint now.
Yeah, exactly.
But not a saint because of the good things he did or his good sentiments. Right. And he's not a saint he's not a saint despite the people who died because of his actions, right, of which there was a lot of repression, exile to Siberia, executions and the like. Neither despite that nor because of his certain qualities of goodness, he's a saint because he died as a martyr to evil, to
Yeah.
communism. That's how the church sees it. And yet there are reasons to suggest that he was a highly moral person, obsessed with certain moral principles. The question is, what are those moral principles? Because to say somebody's moral, the question should be, well, what do you think is moral? What do you think is good?
Right.
And for Nicholas, goodness meant duty above all. And duty meant I do my job because I've inherited it. Nobody asked me. Nobody had to ask me. I'm the oldest son of the last ruler. It's my job.
Right.
He knew he was going to take the job. It would be irresponsible and immoral for him to decline it.
No, of course.
And that actually there's an interesting moment in 1917 when that's exactly what happens with his brother, but anyway, his uncle. And so he keeps the job. He feels it's his duty to his father, who had a certain vision of ruling, a very strong vision of a strong state, of an emphasis on Russian nationalism in many ways. His duty to his father is to be true to his father's ideals. He also felt he had a duty to, as people say, to his family. But his idea of family was meant to be an example of his love of the nation. So his idea was, I need to love everybody like my own children. I need to care for them. I need to make sure they're happy. If they behave badly, I need to discipline them because I'm a good father. The father of all Russians. Tsar Batyushka, they say, the Tsar father. And so he's driven by a whole set of moral values, of course, which are grounded in religion, which lead him to make both good decisions and bad. He makes some very good decisions, such as in 1905, when there is a revolution which totally surprises him. He really didn't see it coming, which says something about his education and his knowledge of his own society, which was limited in all sorts of ways. Not his fault, but he was taught that way. He says, when given choices, when listening to ministers, one of whom says, well, military dictatorship, that'll end this revolution. And another says, no. We got to move into the modern era with some degree of basic civil liberties and a democratic electoral institution that can actually have legislative power. He opts for the left. He opts for liberalization and democracy because he cares about progress, and he can't see a bloodbath. He's told military dictatorship will require a bloodbath, and he says, I just can't do it. That'll break the bond between Tsar and people. On the other hand, because he so believes in these ancient ideas of what Russia is, he finds that the misbehaviors, the unruliness of democracy, it needs to be controlled. And so he takes some very strong actions to limit all of that freedom, rather than let it flow, let it develop, let it grow, let it mature. He couldn't do that because one of his moral principles is discipline, self-discipline. And if people elect people to parliament and make loud speeches, think of the British Parliament, right? What the Queen must think, right? You can't do that. This is uncontrolled. This is irresponsible. Be mature. And if you won't, I will force you to. I will find to limit your power. And so his sets of, I would say he's a highly moral individual whose moral opinions, whose moral values, his ideas of virtue led to both important reforms, and there were many. He gave workers the right to strike, form unions and the like, but also led to his constantly cutting back on those one might say progressive reforms, because they were so disorderly. He hated disorder. He was a very orderly man who wanted to rule over an orderly people. And they weren't.
Right. And it's interesting to see, especially with these autocratic rulers, right, they're sort of just sort of their mindset about their certain things, like Hitler, for example, was very obsessed with cleanliness. Whenever he talked about getting rid of the Jews, it was always in terms of like eliminating a pest or disease from a healthy body. He really framed things in terms of making things clean and healthy, right? And so it does kind of make sense to step into the mind of Nicholas II and be like, right, to him, to have, you know, the Duma have real power would just be a mess. It would just be too messy, and he can't have a state, right? In his mind, I'm sure it was similar to like, I don't ask all my daughters what we're going to have for dinner. That would just be a terrible idea, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah,
Order,
and I mean,
order is really important. Order is a virtue for him.
right, you know, and it's fascinating to see the mindset of somebody, right? Because it's like when you can impose yourself on a country like that, your mindset and the way you look at the world and approach things really matters, you know.
Yeah.
And all the little nuances in your brain really do matter and impact the lives of all these people. And it's just crazy to see how people's brains work in those situations. So I have kind of a two-pronged question here for you.
Okay.
So the first thing is, what do you think the impact of World War II, the impacts of World War II and communism are on the Russian people today? So those are two kind of separate questions, but right, what was the impact that the German invasion and really the genocide that they committed there had on the Russian people, and even the people that the Russians were occupying at the time? And then what is the effect of this communist takeover that really set in for the bulk of the 20th century and really just dominated every aspect of it? I mean, it's the only totalitarian society to really like push itself way beyond, you know. And so what do you think are kind of the impacts of that on those people?
You mean after World War II, communist?
Right.
Yeah. So two things to your two-pronged question. I mean, one, in terms of the impact of World War II, it was a trauma. Millions died.
Yeah.
They really thought the Russian nation might come to an end. People fought both officially in the Red Army and you know, as partisans in
right behind the lines. Yeah.
Incredibly heroic ways. I mean, there's just, you can't exaggerate the heroism. This is not just myth. It becomes myth, but it's not just that.
Right.
And the effect of that was probably to give legitimacy to communism in Russia that it never fully had before.
Yeah.
In the majority of the population, including rural populations.
Oh yeah.
Suddenly the Soviet state, and in this case it happens to be the Stalinist state, so it's a particular model of communism,
right.
was clearly justified, because otherwise the Germans would have won, and and beat all of Europe too. I mean, I think Russians rightly believe that without their role in the war, the Germans might have won.
Yeah,
it's
for sure.
Not clear. I mean, the US didn't want to get into it, and it's not clear we would have come in soon enough.
Right.
Or could even win. It's across an ocean.
Right, exactly.
Clearly the French and the English didn't have the capacity.
Right.
At that point, sad to say.
Yeah.
So it gave a real legitimacy to this system that it had never had before. And that it also gave, and that legitimacy is based on nation, on national pride, not on communism. So one might also say that that's the point communism is no longer relevant. It's the end of the dream of building a communist society.
Yeah.
You know, no one makes any pretense about it. When I was living there in the 1980s, a friend of mine, you know, which is a generation later, a friend of mine, but you know, said to me, he didn't think there was a single person in the Soviet Union who believed in communism. He said, not one, not anybody, not, you know, the leaders of the Communist Party, not Brezhnev, not it. No, not a one. Nobody takes communist ideology seriously. It's about nation, it's about holding power, it's about Russia, it's about the Soviet Union as a country. Forget communism, it's just they pretend to talk about the ideology nobody believes. That, I think it's not entirely true, but it's mostly true. Yeah. Communism becomes no longer the dream at that point. But communist rule does. Yeah. One might argue in China, you know, today, Communist Party rule is what it's about. It's not about the ideology that Marx and Engels and Mao even had. Yeah. So that's I think that's very important. I think it's hard to say what would have happened if we left the Germans out of the story and there was no World War II, how the Soviet Union would have evolved.
Right.
We don't know, but it certainly solidified Communist Party rule and made ideology much less important. Just order was important. And by the way, the Germans were, you were mentioning the way Nazis portrayed Jews. Germans were always portrayed as vermin, as animals, as insects, as semi-human hybrids, partly animal, of which the world needed to be cleansed of. And of course, the purges, the so-called purges in Russia of enemies, purge means to cleanse. Literally, the Russian word is to cleanse.
Wow.
So this is a widespread idea that your enemy is not even, is impure,
Right.
maybe not even human.
Right.
So ridding the world of those monstrous beasts was seen as a great achievement and helped support for the state. Occupying Eastern Europe was never welcome. I mean, the Nazi Soviet pact, that was not a bad idea, many people thought.
Right.
If it was really to keep the Nazis from invading us,
right.
All right, we'll sacrifice some people, Ukraine mostly.
Right. Right.
No, but what it wasn't so much the buffer. I mean, armies move fast. They never really thought it mattered. What they thought was that it would give them time, that maybe the Nazis would come after them eventually, but they weren't ready. They needed time to prepare. Now, they didn't prepare. That's a whole nother story.
No, right.
But moving into Eastern Europe and occupying it, I mean, it would have been nice if there were pro-Soviet countries there, but to actually really become seen as virtually imperial rulers of Eastern Europe, to bring down the so-called Iron Curtain, did not help Russia. It was not seen as appealing, especially after Stalin died, which was in 1953, so it wasn't that much longer.
No, right.
People really, especially after Stalin's death, the idea that they were really trying to keep control of Poles. We know Poles are so much trouble, always trouble. Hungary, places like that, it's like, really?
Right.
It just, and not to mention parts of Germany.
Right.
It really just didn't appeal to them as something desirable, as something positive, as something good. So it was a negative effect. It was a negative influence on them, which eventually, as we know, brought communism down. One might argue that it was the existence of this communist Eastern Europe that was never willing, it was never welcome, was something that actually Russians weren't that thrilled about. And when it collapsed, they were happy to let it collapse. What they didn't entirely perceive, what Gorbachev didn't perceive, is it was going to keep going. And that Russians would say, we never believed in communism in the first place. Young people in the 90s and 91 said, I don't believe in it. My parents don't believe in it.
Right.
Communist Party members don't believe in it. Why are we still doing this? And so it ended up being a big mistake, one might, to put it overly simply.
Yeah, well, right. And I mean, it's to me, at least, it's easy to see how, your ideology sort of demands this world revolution, right? And they're like, oh, we have to bring everybody into the communist fold. And right, the longer communism went on, especially in Russia, it became clear that was just not a realistic dream. Like you said, I mean, you can't get these revolutions going, right? The places that have communist setups are often places that we conquered, right? Eastern Europe, and we're imposing communism on these places. It's never these industrialized nations. It's always these agricultural nations, right? And Stalin openly declares pretty early on in the 30s that they're going to do communism in one country. And it's like, well, isn't that kind of like against the point? It's easy to see how Trotsky, who was pushing for the world revolution, saw this as a betrayal, because right, in his mind, he's like, communism in one country is against the ideology itself. So right, it is.
But if I could say, Stalin was the practical one here, because it wasn't going to happen anywhere else.
Right.
Not in the short. It was exactly Lenin's argument. Look, of course, we're doomed if we don't have revolution in Germany and elsewhere. But what are we going to do? It's not our job to invade.
Yeah.
They tried it very briefly in Poland. They thought they could march the Red Army and the Poles would rise up, and they immediately learned, no, just the opposite happens. It doesn't
exactly
work. You don't bring revolution on the point of a bayonet. This became a lesson that was repeated. So in that sense, Stalin said nothing that was very surprising to anybody. It was completely practical. Trotsky said nothing surprising to anybody. Actually, yes, of course we want world revolution. They really, actually, the difference isn't that great. The real way, what Trotsky's critique had to do with bureaucratization, not so much socialism in one country, which is, it was just a, you know, I don't think it was the central problem, but bureaucratization, moving away from the ideology of mass participation, in other words, communism, which is mass mobilization, that was a big concern.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Well, all right. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time, everybody. This is Professor Mark Steinberg. And again, he's got a book just came out, Russian Utopia, A Century of Revolutionary Possibilities. There you go, right there. Look at that.
And it's very short. It's easy to read.
Yeah, perfect.
Century of Revolutionary Possibilities in a thin book. I hope that's not symbolic, right?
Right. No, it certainly
to be
was
easy to read.
Fascinating time. Thank you so much for your time. It was absolutely great to have you here. Maybe we'll have you on again sometime in the future. But yeah, I think this was great, and I hope my viewers enjoyed it just as much as I have.
I hope so too. And good luck with your program.
Awesome. Thank you so much.